Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another Esop Centre webinar in conjunction with the FS Club. We are absolutely delighted today to have William Franklin here with us. William is talking about awarding shares to employees in a COVID-19 world, how to make good use of the government's share incentive plan. And with many of the recent mini-budget announcements, this is certainly something to pay attention to. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Mainelli. I am one of the directors of the CN Group. And it really is my privilege to be able to introduce today's session and to help with the question and answer commentary. And I can only do that, or we can only do that, because of our sponsors. We have a rich and wide range of sponsors, and we'd like to thank them for letting us go so widely and freely across all areas of financial services, technology, and economics. So it's going to be fascinating today. Now, the program today is very much, I'm here to get out of your way so that you can hear William's words of wisdom. And we will be starting in just a minute there. But there is ample time for Q&A. And so I'd encourage you to use the GoToWebinar facility on your panel there. And the facility is really quite important because both William and I are focused on today's presentation with you. And therefore, we won't be responding to emails till afterwards. So do kick in with questions, comments, observations, even stories you might have about your experiences with employee share ownership or share incentive plans. William, I think that's it. Everything else I know is online, and we like to get straight to the point, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. If I could have the next slide. Just a brief word about Pet Franklin and myself. We specialise in the design and implementation of employee share schemes, such as the share incentive plan, and also the conversion of companies to employee ownership trust ownership structures. That's like John Lewis. We are a law firm, but I'm very proud to always say I'm not a lawyer. I'm a chartered accountant. And that's important because we are a multidisciplinary firm. We are a niche firm, and we also are very committed to training, which is, these days, a bit unusual because we are perhaps uniquely for a law firm, as well as being a training office for the Law Society, we're also a training office for the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And that means that as well as the legal and tax aspects, we are experts in the financial aspects of share schemes, valuation, financial projections, modelling, and accounting for share schemes, and the use of Black-Scholes mathematics as it applies to employee share schemes. So I like to think, and I think it is true, we are quite an innovative firm because we're at that crossover point between law and accounting. The firm's been going for about 10 years. It was founded by me and David Peck, who many of you will know is perhaps the most eminent share scheme lawyer of his generation. So if we could just now turn to SIPs themselves and just quickly talk about the basics of SIPs. Michael, could you move the slide? Yeah. There are basically three ways you can receive shares under the government share incentive plan. You can be awarded shares free. There's a maximum limit per person of £3,600 per annum. That's the value of the shares. You can also buy shares under what are called partnership shares, and there the limit is £1,800 worth of shares a year. And if you buy shares, the company can choose to match them up to a ratio of 2 to 1. So potentially, in a single year, an individual can receive shares under a share incentive plan up to the value of £9,000. In addition to that, if the shares that are held in a SIP receive dividends, it is possible for those dividends to be paid in the form of additional shares, which will be tax-free and count as further SIP shares. So, let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the magics of SIPs is the tax relief. The shares that someone receives free, either free shares themselves or matching shares, are tax-free. Now that's a huge point because normally when someone is awarded shares in their employer, if it's outside of a SIP, that award of free shares would be taxable employment income. And very possibly taxable immediately under PAYE. So making the shares tax-free is a huge advantage and one of the reasons people use SIPs. If you buy shares under the partnership arrangement, then you actually get, in addition to the shares obviously being tax-free, you actually get tax relief on the cost of buying the shares. And the company, in addition, can receive national insurance relief on the salary that you have used to acquire shares in the company. If you hold the shares for 5 years before there's a disposal, then the disposal at that point is completely tax-free. So you can see that this is really a quite extraordinarily generous regime from a tax point of view. Next slide, Michael. But of course, to get within such a generous tax relief, there are various conditions you have to satisfy. 4 of the ones I'd just like to point to at the moment are that the award has to be on an all-employee basis, i.e. you can't just pick and choose, the employer can't just pick and choose who should receive the awards. They also have to be made on similar terms. And that's, there's the scope there for definitional differences, but fundamentally the principle here is one of sort of egalitarian sharing. The really important point is that the shares have to be held in a trust, a special SIP trust. So the employees, while they're within the SIP, do not actually have immediate direct ownership. They have beneficial ownership, but not the legal title, because they're all shepherded together in a trust. And another really important point is that the shares, the company over which the shares are awarded, has to be an independent company. You can't set up a SIP for a subsidiary. So if we can move on to the next slide. Just a bit of history I think is useful. The SIP was an introduction at the beginning of the new millennium by the new Labour government. It was intended to encourage employee ownership, and it was part of a package of new share incentives that were introduced simultaneously. The other big change at that time was EMI options. The SIP was actually built on existing arrangements because there had been a predecessor scheme called the Approved Profit Sharing Scheme where free shares could be awarded that had been introduced by the previous Labour government in the 1970s. So the SIP was seen as a sort of modernisation of an existing arrangement. Part of the thinking behind the initial planning for the SIP was that the SAYE scheme would be withdrawn. But that idea, following lobbying, was abandoned. So what has the outcome of all this been? Well, the EMI scheme has been widely regarded as a huge success. It underpins a lot of the life science and technology sectors in this country. But SIPs have been somewhat disappointing. Part of the driving force behind the introduction of the SIP was the hope of Gordon Brown that there would be a big increase in the take-up of all employee share schemes by unquoted companies. But that has not happened. Now, why is that? Well, I think there's a variety of reasons, one of which is that SAYE continued to exist. It's a standardised scheme, and it has been the preferred scheme used by many larger quoted companies. There was possibly a design flaw as well in the SIP, which has not been remedied, which was that compared with the old approved profit sharing scheme, the holding period of 5 years was an extension from what previously existed of 3 years. And of course, SAYE, you can get all the tax reliefs after 3 years potentially. So extending the 5 to 5 years has proved a deterrent. There are also quite complex rules if you have a leaver within that 5-year period, or there's a disposal of the company within that 5-year period. And since we're dealing with shares, and there's the possibility of clawbacks of tax relief if conditions aren't met or people leave early, there are some quite complex administration, and cost-effective solutions were not really available for smaller companies. Next slide, please. Now, after about 10 years, the Office of Tax Simplification had a look at the way the SIP and other share schemes were operating. And David Pett had an opportunity at that time to make representations for some changes to the legislation, which were intended primarily to make it easier for unquoted companies to operate SIPs. Some quite serious design flaws in the SIP legislation had become apparent, and these were to a significant extent remedied in the Finance Act 2013, most notably by allowing much greater restrictions on the shares that were specifically for SIPs. However, the take-up of SIPs amongst the unquoted sector and the smaller quoted sector has still remained fairly low. So why is that? Well, I think part of it is that the significance of the 2013 reforms were probably poorly understood by advisors. We'd had a decade or so of the SIP being a bit of a disappointment, with the result that many advisors have fairly limited experience of applying SIPs outside of the large quoted company space and have lost interest. Also, there's this problem of the costs of administering SIPs being potentially disproportionate for smaller companies. Again, within the quoted sector, SIPs were adopted reasonably enthusiastically by larger quoted companies, although whether the level of take-up actually was equivalent to what existed before under the old approved profit sharing scheme is difficult to say. The evidence was that after a period of time, actually the take-up for SIPs was lower than the APS, but those sort of statistics no longer get published. But generally within the quoted sector, there was a concern, I think, amongst many management teams that the use of SIPs could squeeze the capacity, the space for executive share schemes within dilution limits. So that has probably held back the use of SIPs. Generally, of course, there's the reluctance of owners in unquoted companies to share equity with all employees. Often the thinking is, well, what's the point of doing so? A large part of the UK privately owned companies is, of course, backed by private equity. And there is a major stumbling block in the application of SIPs, which is the independence test. Because most or many private equity-backed companies are actually controlled by the private equity backer, so would fail that test and be unable to qualify for the SIP schemes. For those companies that do operate SIPs, there are some practical issues that people sometimes are surprised by. The point of it being an all-employee scheme means that whenever an award is made, it has to be made to all employees. So you cannot just top up awards for new joiners or exclude poor performance. If it's an unquoted company, you will need to know the market value of your shares in order to know whether you're within those really quite small limits that each individual can have. Now, the good news is that HMRC will agree valuations in advance of the awards being made, which is very helpful, but you still have to do a valuation. And if someone leaves, say before the 5 years is up, then there are some really quite complex, even after the 2013 reforms, some quite complex clawback rules on the tax relief. This can trip people up, and it's really important that employees, when they go into the scheme and join, that these risks and possibilities are explained to them at the outset, so there are no surprises. Next slide, please. There are some deeper issues, I think, to do with SIPs that, are that they don't. One of the problems is they don't really help transitory employees in workforces. Because of the 5-year rule, many people who just work for a short period of time would never benefit from a SIP. So that whole problem of workforces that are on short-term contracts or don't work for a long period for their employers, the SIP really isn't designed for the modern world. There's another problem, which is that the SIP can actually shut out younger and poorer employees. who cannot afford to buy the shares and therefore miss out on the opportunity for additional free shares through partnerships and matching shares. But if an employer is willing just to give free shares, they can of course still benefit, but if they leave within the 5 years, they'll never get the full benefit of a SIP. Another problem that people encounter when they set up a SIP is what I call the paradox of unwelcome choice. The SIP is designed to give choice to employers in the way it's used and offer a whole sort of menu of opportunities. It is, once you can fit within its rules, quite flexible and gives a variety of ways it can be applied. But the problem with that choice is it causes the management of a company when setting up a scheme to have to make a whole string of quite complex and unfamiliar design decisions. That means they have to have informed guidance. Now, I've been talking about some of the drawbacks. I think that's only fair, given you want to hear a sort of balanced view. However, there's obviously huge attractions for a SIP. Not only the tax relief. This structure, whereby the shares are held in a trust, is really advantageous because it means that ownership can be managed. The share register is not cluttered with lots of small shareholders. Notwithstanding that, however, ownership is real. The employee does have a right to those shares. They are the beneficial owner. And so you are talking here not about a potential or contingent right to employee ownership, which you get with options, but a real direct ownership in the shares. And it gives people, therefore, potentially a sense of ownership and the reality of ownership. The employee potentially can build up, if there are regular awards and the company grows in value, a really valuable tax-free holding in their employer. When the SIP legislation was introduced back at the beginning of the millennium, dividends were taxable generally at whatever level they were paid. But since then, reliefs have been introduced and the dividend tax regime has been changed, so that now the first £2,000 of dividends are tax-free. So if someone holds shares in a company through a SIP, those dividends that can be paid to them can, up to that limit, be received tax-free. There's also corporation tax relief. We focus so far on the position of the employee, but the SIP is an extraordinarily generous tax relief because, in addition to those employment tax reliefs, the company can claim a corporation tax relief on the transfer of shares into a SIP trust. So, perhaps the most powerful use, I think, of a SIP is as a retention tool. Because if the employee stays with the company and the value grows, they start to have a really meaningful stake in the business. Next slide, please. So, what are the big design issues when setting up a SIP? I think the old maxim of keep things simple applies to SIPs. And I think one of the most important things when designing a SIP is to consider the administration consequences of design choices. Very often that is overlooked when share schemes are set up. But with a SIP, because you are dealing with shares and you're dealing with all the employees, quite small design choices can have big implications later on with the administration and the cost of running the scheme, which people don't always focus on when they simply look at the legal drafting or the tax analysis. What I have in mind here are things like voting rights and levers. The 2013 changes did give the company a lot more scope to put restrictions on shares, which can simplify the operation of a SIP. And that's something that I don't think people always take full advantage of. Within a SIP, you can specify maximum holding period or minimum holding periods for the employee. So this is a situation where, let's say, an employee doesn't leave, but you can, and therefore there isn't an automatic disposal of the shares at that point. But the employee, while remaining an employee, decides they would like to get hold of the shares themselves and possibly sell them. You can, within a SIP, put time limits that prevent an employee doing that for several years. When you design a SIP, particularly in an unquoted company, you do need to think ahead and try and anticipate the kind of exit routes that might arise and think through how those would work out. The key thing here often is to do worked examples and just think through the consequences. Another thing where worked examples I think can be extraordinarily useful is thinking ahead as to where the shares are coming from to satisfy the SIP and how many will be needed, not just now, but in the future. Because very often SIPs are awarded on an annual or fairly regular basis. So it's not just a question of working out how many shares you want to use now for this year's award, but also thinking ahead to future awards and how many you may need then, and planning for this. If you've got an unquoted company, you will need a valuation whenever you make an award. That valuation needs to be consistent with the fundamental valuation principle that you find in section 273 of the Capital Gains Tax Act 1992. I don't normally like to quote sections, but it is a relevant one because that's the section that says the market value is the price which the shares would fetch on sale in an open market. Now, in an unquoted company, you do need to have a basis for arriving at that valuation. The revenue will not accept formulas, but you will need, I think, at the very least, to have a policy for yourself as to how you would anticipate arriving at those valuations. I mentioned earlier that there was a fourth form of the SIP, in addition to free shares, partnership shares, and matching shares, in the form of dividend shares under the SIP. But you might ask yourself, why do I want to have the complexity of dividend shares when employees could receive £2,000 tax-free in cash? Isn't that what most employees would prefer? So why give yourself the complexity of dividend shares? I mentioned that the SIP, the shares in the SIP have to be held in a trust. Now that's actually quite an unusual trust because it's something very rare in the UK, a UK purpose trust. It's not a conventional employee benefit trust. And the uses to which shares in a SIP trust can be put is quite restricted. Basically, it's limited to a use within a share incentive plan. So it's much more restricted than a conventional EBT. So that raises the question of whether shares that are intended for the SIP but are not yet ready to be used in the SIP should be held in some more flexible vehicle, some kind of separate feeding or holder trust, which is an EBT, which is more flexible. There are pros and cons for that, and you don't get the corporation tax relief that I mentioned earlier simply for putting shares into a standard EBT. And finally, I'd just like to mention again the point about the design of the SIP. How complicated do you want to make the rules? Do you want to be able to deal with all potential situations that might arise in the menu of choice that a SIP is? Or do you want something more limited? There are arguments for both ways. But remember, if you choose to have a scheme that is capable of dealing with all possible circumstances, your client or the company setting up the scheme is going to have to consider design issues for all sorts of hypothetical situations which may never actually arise in practice. And that can be quite a time-consuming and seemingly pointless exercise. Okay, where how could one use the SIP then in this post-COVID world? Well, the idea has been around for a long time that SIPs, awarding shares to employees, could be an alternative to pay increases. And that undoubtedly has been used, but less so than one might have expected, because I think largely of the administration problems of running a SIP, which have often deterred people who started down that route. SIPs are a benefit of being an employee. If your employer has a SIP and runs a SIP, it's undoubtedly something that is attractive to employees. And so it's a benefit of being an employee rather than a contractor. Also, you can turn that around and think about the position of the employer firm. If it does have a SIP, then it's a way of rewarding people which is not open to contractors. In these times of great stress and great uncertainty about the future, it's a real way, it's potentially a real way of showing that we really are all in it together. Now we're getting into more speculative territory here, but it's possible that as we come out of the immediate aftermath of COVID and move more into the economic consequences of it, the role of government in funding business and supporting business will intensify. New debt arrangements to support businesses over the next period may emerge. And I think that's raising the question, not just in the UK, but all over the world, as to whether some of that government debt to support business will get converted into equity. Now, this is a different kind of capitalism that we're looking at, with potentially governments having significant minority stakes in private business. A lot of people are going to be uncomfortable with that, but potentially they do open up an opportunity for the use of SIPs as a way of transferring some of that ownership by the state away from permanent state ownership into employee ownership. Some people believe that other forms, executive-based incentives, might be made dependent on the company involving the full range of its employees. So another potential development we might see is for the SIP to be a condition of other share schemes. If that happened, it would certainly increase the use of SIPs and generally drive up or widen employee share ownership. Another possibility that might happen is, particularly for unquoted companies, valuation is one of the most difficult things, and increasingly difficult things, in the design of executive share schemes in the unquoted sector. It's getting more and more difficult for to get HMRC to agree to valuations. So potentially companies that had a SIP would have a route for being able to agree a valuation of the shares, which might be helpful, at least indirectly, for other shares as well. Potentially that route might even be turned into another condition. So I think if we use imagination, it's quite possible that the SIP could become quite an important way of leaning against the current forces in society and economies for widening inequality. So potentially it could have a role in what is sometimes called the levelling up agenda, but we shall see. Next slide, please. Whatever happens, I think a really central point, if the SIP is ever to be successful, is employee communication. When the scheme is set up, the company really needs to explain carefully to employees how to join. There are far too many stories of people being given the opportunity and failing to join simply through ignorance on the part of the employee because the company never explained it properly. So that means explaining the benefits. It means explaining how it works. But just getting take-up is only part of the story. For the employer to get real value out of a SIP, you must make sure that employees don't forget it, don't take it for granted. So you need to keep the message going about just how valuable and remarkable an award they have received. And I think the key point there is integrate that communication in the years to come with other messages so that the employees are regularly reminded about just what a valuable asset and what considerable trouble the company has gone to putting it in place for them. That just about finishes what I intended to say. So over to you, Michael.
Well, not at all. In fact, thank you so much, William. That was extremely interesting, lucid, and I like your speculation at the end. And we've got quite a few questions. Folks, just a reminder to do put your questions in quickly because we don't really have a lot of time here. So I'll just kick off, if I might. Jennifer would like to know, with unquoted companies, how are bad leavers and their tax dealt with if there are only certain times of the year when share dealing can take place?
Well, I think that's a very good question, but I don't think it's something we really can deal with at that level of detail on a webinar like this. So, Jennifer, if you would like to contact me on that point, by all means do so by email. But I think we can't really get into detailed technical questions in this form.
And that's fair enough, Ruben. Anybody who sends a question through, I will be sure to send you their email so that you can contact them, and you'll get Jennifer's. Thank you very much, Jennifer. We'll take that offline then with William directly. There's a question from James. You talked about the complex clawbacks of tax relief and things like that. One of the questions was, where on balance do these things fall? Is it the employee's problem or is it the employer's problem? Who does HMRC go after, I guess?
That is a very, very interesting question. I think it boils down to the employer. They can potentially go after both, but HMRC, when there is essentially a failure to operate PAYE correctly, will much prefer to go after the employer because they have the pockets, they have the money. They're easier to deal with than lots of individual employees. So I think, generally speaking, the revenue, even if they haven't necessarily always got the full statutory powers, if they find something has gone wrong, it will be usually through the operation of a PAYE review. And so the natural place is to go to the employer.
You spoke about the complexity in private equity in terms of proving independence. We've got a question here from Victoria. But if I set up a SIP and it's running and then I am taken over by a private equity firm, is that a different situation?
Yeah, now you're into a disposal, aren't you? You're going to have to look at the terms of the SIP and to see whether that creates an exit event where there will be a sale. Then you're into the question of, has 5 years elapsed? Is it tax-free, or has less than 5 years elapsed since the award of the shares? And then you get into some of the quite complex issues about what is the consideration that the SIP shareholders receive. Do they receive cash, in which case they may or may not have to pay some tax on that, or can they actually sometimes receive loan notes from the new purchaser that allows them to continue to have an equity interest after the actual end of the SIP arrangement itself, but still build up the 5 years by holding debt for a period of time and then cashing it out later. So then you get a different question: what's going to happen once it's owned by private equity? You've got a new owner. What are they going to do? Can they replicate the scheme in a new way? That will very often depend on what kind of ownership structure they have, whether they have control. If they have, then they almost certainly won't be able to do a SIP. They'll have to do something else if they do anything.
There's a question here. I think you're very good at explaining the various options: EMI, SIP, SAYE. somebody really just like, can I do them all? I may not want to, but can I do them all, or do they conflict with each
Yeah,
other?
yes. I mean, there are EMIs. You can do SAY. You can do SIPs. You can do unapproved schemes like JSOPs, and completely unapproved schemes like unapproved options. You can do them all. I mean, the constraint, of course, is dilution.
Hmm.
That someone is going to reduce their holding in the company in direct proportion to what goes to employees. So the other owners have to be willing to tolerate that and think that it's in their interests and the common interest to do that.
Matthew, there's a lot of questions like this. I'll just tip a few off if I might. Matthew's curious, and I'm guessing that this is about timing, but can I set up 2 SIPs?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, potentially you could have 2 SIPs, and that sometimes happens. You set up one SIP, and then the next year you make another award. Now, very often the rules of the SIP scheme will have some flexibility in it. So you might, for example, one year just make free share awards, and then the next year you might make partnership share awards with matching shares. And then next year you might just go back to free shares. You might change the criteria on which you make awards. As I said, they have to be on similar terms to all employees, but what similar terms means can vary from year to year, providing your rules permit that. So yes, you can have an overarching scheme which has a lot of flexibility in it, or you can actually have 2 different schemes with different sort of parameters that you then make use of. I mean, the SIP, this is where the SIP is remarkably flexible. There is an awful lot of choice at this level, and it can get baffling. But of course, the thing to remember is when you do all of that, you have to keep track of what's happened, because you will have shareholders who will have received awards under all sorts of different bases, and someone has to keep track of that.
Yeah.
And I guess this is a point I wasn't really wanting to get into in great detail, but I think one of the pitfalls of SIPs is something called the Excel spreadsheet. I mean, Excel spreadsheets are wonderful things for calculating. Absolutely marvellous. But they are terrible things for keeping track of complex records. And one of the real dangers of SIPs is that people set up the records on an Excel spreadsheet, and someone sets it up, someone writes it, the person who wrote it understood it, and then they leave, and then someone new comes in and has to try and keep the records using a spreadsheet they don't understand. And that is a recipe for something to go wrong. So it comes back to administration and keeping the records and databases accurate from the start.
I mean, it sounds to me you're quite in favor of the SIP trust model, and I can almost see this because there's like a cutout there, isn't there, where I've got the complexity of the corporation and the relation. I've then got the trust, and then I'm just allocating via the trust where the rewards should go. Yeah,
I think that, I mean, you have to have the trust. The legislation prescribed it. I mean, it didn't need to, but 20 years ago, someone made the decision that you have to have a trust. I think the big consequence of that is that you can shepherd the shares. You know, 20 years ago, we were still living in the age of popular capitalism, the idea that it was a great idea to have lots of shareholders, that quoted companies, most quoted companies now just want to get rid of their small shareholders because there's so much hassle. And the same applies to employee share ownership. It's a hassle factor if you've got lots of individuals on the share register. So the trust is a way of gathering them together and managing them. If they leave early, getting back the shares relatively easily. All of that is non-tax, but it's very practical and very important why the SIP trust is a good idea.
A few people out here appreciate that they're trying to get kind of a boundary, and they're asking a lot of questions about size of firm that this applies to. I might phrase the question as well. Is there sort of an ideal firm? If you walked into a business, what characteristics would you say? I'm surprised they don't have a SIP.
No, I don't think there is. Let me try and answer that in an effective way. If you are a large quoted company with serious systems and a big budget, and you want to use employee share ownership to the maximum extent, then SIP is probably a no-brainer, providing you've got lots of UK employees. Because remember, SIPs only work for UK taxpayers. So if you're in that sort of a large UK quoted company, it would be strange not to make use of such an advantageous scheme. Once you get beyond that, it all starts to become much more difficult, I think. And is there a minimum size? Well, no. I mean, I was talking to a client where we put in a SIP where they had 3 employees. Actually, when it's down to 3 employees and they keep it very simple, it's not too difficult to manage. Mm-hmm. Once you start getting dozens of employees, though, you've just got to think about maths. You've got dozens of employees, maybe having different types of SIP awards each year for a number of years. You start to get something quite complicated to keep track of. It's all perfectly possible, but unless you keep your eye on the ball, something will go wrong. So I think between those two spaces, it really comes down to thinking through how you will run and manage the SIP after setting it up. And that's what we talk about as much as it should be.
You ended on some really fascinating stuff that I'd love to be sitting in a socially distanced pub discussing with you late at night about the future of, you said, a different kind of capitalism, perhaps, and what the government might do. This leads to a slightly different question, though, is, this has been a stable arrangement for 20 years with the review in 7 years ago. How stable do you see the SIP arrangements going forward?
I think the SIP does fit with the temper of the times. I think there is a sense that there needs to be a greater sharing of wealth, and the SIP is a way of doing that. I think the structure whereby it avoids having an upfront tax charge on the award of free shares is enormously important. I think it's something that actually culturally fits with what is needed. I think the question is whether it needs further reform to make it easier to operate and more attractive. It's a sort of old chestnut, but extending the period from 3 to 5 years was not a smart thing to do. And if it was reduced back to the 3 years of the older profit, the profit sharing scheme from the 1970s, quite a lot of the awful administrative issues and tax clawback issues would be greatly simplified. So I think it's stable, but actually it needs to be reformed to really put some sort of dynamism into it.
Yeah, it is somewhat paradoxical that, as we know, the pace of change is changing, that this 3 to 5 year thing means now you have to plan out. It almost assumes a highly stable organization in a way. William, this has been super, really good. I'd love to have you back. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring things to a close, but I might just read out a comment here, which shows the amount of thought you got going. It's from Ian in West Halifax. I buy into the idea of reducing inequality through wider ownership of corporations, but I'm not convinced that those people must be conventional employees in order for that buy-in and involvement to happen. Subcontracting doesn't have to be exploitative gig economy style. And might we need more imaginative, flexible working arrangements that might not be employment but might include share ownership? So I think we're going to see a lot of your thoughts coming into this space in the future. How can we use these schemes to reshape capitalism as we move forward? Absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid I've got to give some thanks, if I might. So my first round of thanks, if I can, is to our sponsors. We have a lot on our website, as you know, not just our list of sponsors, but a fair number of resources. Please do read Newspad, which is our monthly roundup of everything to do with employee share ownership. And I might point out globally, it's not just UK. We also have a number of bulletins, and the bulletins that we have are available to you free of charge. Just go and sign up and get them. We have a couple, not just on employee share ownership, but on some of the wider issues which William was touching on, of reduced inequalities and some of the sustainable development goals. And I think we can all see from recent announcements there's going to be a tremendous amount of discussion here in the UK and around the world on what is the future of the public-private divide, owners and employees. So that's a real thank you to our sponsors for letting us range widely and freely. And a thank you to you, the audience. Without you, this wouldn't serve any purpose. So thanks very much for coming and staying online. And what I just like to put out is we have a fascinating event tomorrow, Building a Global Britain. That's with Lord Grimstone, Minister for Trade, but also with Kate 80. The indomitable Kate 80 is online, and you need to be online because this will not be recorded. Transforming the Post-Pandemic World kicks off next week with Robert Harecock coming out of BT Labs. We have Tools of Engagement with Deloitte on employee planning. We have Portfolio Protection and Security Class Actions with David Seidel. If you want to get into some of the complexity in that area. And finally, also on share valuation week after, where we're going to be looking on the wisdom of price setting. So it's going to be a fascinating look ahead. William, of course, the real thanks have to be to you for preparing so well and delivering such a coherent presentation. Sadly, in this current COVID world, hopefully in post we'll figure out how to do it. I have to do all the applause for you, and I have my little applause-o-meter here, and I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the whole audience. We would really look forward to having you back again. Thank you so much.
Right, that'd be very good. I'd look forward to that. And, I have to get one of those applause devices for myself.
Yes, it's come from a Buddhist temple of all places. So it's my inner secular Buddhist. Anyway, I'll stop the recording now, if I might, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon.
That'd be great. Thanks. Cheers, man.